Okay, this is chapter 1 of...
Can I see my booty?
No, I can't see your booty.
Good.
Because you're off... Yeah, good. It's chapter 1 of Dragondrums. The rumble, thud, boom of the big drums answering a message from the east roused Pemer. In his 5 turns at the Harpercraft Hall, he had never become accustomed to that bone-throbbing noise. Perhaps, he thought, sleepily turning over, if the drums beat every dawn, or in the same sequence, he'd get accustomed enough to sleep through it. But he doubted that. He was naturally a light sleeper, a talent picked up when he'd been a herder's boy and had to keep an ear awake for night alarms among the runner beasts. The facility had often been to his advantage, since the other apprentices in his dormitory couldn't sneak up on him with vengeance in mind. And he was often awakened by discreet, dragon-born visitors coming to see the Master Harper of Pern, or the arrivals and departures of Master Robinson himself, for he was surely one of the most important men on Pern, almost as influential as Flar and Lessa, the weir leaders of Bendon. Occasionally, too, on warm summer nights, when the shutters of the main hall were thrown back, the masters and journeymen assuming all the apprentices slept, he'd hear fascinating and uninhibited talk drifting on the night air. A small fellow like himself had to keep ahead of everyone else, and listening... And listening often showed him how. As he tried to get back to sleep for just a little longer in the gray dawn, the drum sequence echoed in his mind. The message had originated from Ista's Hold's Harper. He had caught the identifying signature. He couldn't be sure of the rest of the message. Something about a ship. Maybe he ought to learn message drum beats. Not that they came in with such frequency now that more and more people own little fire lizards to take messages round and about Pern. He wondered when he'd get his hands on a fire lizard egg. Manoli had promised him one when her queen, Beauty, mated. A nice thought on her part, Pemer reflected, realistically aware that Manoli might not be able to distribute Beauty's eggs as she wished. Master Robinson would want them placed to the Harper Hall's advantage, and Pemer couldn't fault Master Robinson. One day, though, he'd have his fire lizard. A queen, or at the least, a bronze. Do you need something, or do you just want to be with me? Okay, we moved locations so the kids could have an after-dinner snack.
Cookies.
Pemer folded his hands behind his head, musing on such a delightful prospect. From having helped Manoli feed her 9, he knew a fair bit about them now. More than some people who had fire lizards, the same people who'd been claiming for turns that fire lizards were boys' sun dreams. That is, until Fnor, Brown Canth's rider, had impressed a little queen on a beach in the southern continent. Then Manoli, halfway across Pern, had saved a fire lizard queen's eggs from being drowned in the unusually high tides of that turn. Now everyone wanted a fire lizard, and admitted that they must be tiny cousins to the great dragons of Pern. Pemer shivered with delighted terror. Thread had fallen over Fort Hold yesterday. They'd been rehearsing Master Domic's new saga about the search for Lessa and how she'd become weirwoman at Bendon just before the new pass of the Red Star. But Pemer had been much more aware of the silvery threads dropping through the skies above the tightly shuttered and sealed Harper Hall. He'd imagined, as he always did during Threadfall, the graceful passages of the great dragons as their fiery breath charred thread before it could fall to the ground and devour anything living, before it could burrow into the ground and multiply. She's down here under the table. Even thinking of that phenomenon made Pemer quiver fearfully again. Before Master Robinson had discovered Manoli's talent at song-making, she'd actually lived outside her hold, caring for the 9 fire lizards she had impressed from the rescued clutch. If only, thought Pemer with a sigh, he wasn't immured in the craft hall. If only he had a chance to search seashores and find his own clutch. Of course, as a mere apprentice, he'd have to give the eggs to his craftmaster, but surely, if he found a whole clutch, Master Robinson would let him keep one. The sudden raucous call of a fire lizard startled him, and he sat up in alarm. The sun was now streaming across the outer side of the Harper Hall rectangle. He had fallen asleep again. If Rocky was screaming, he was late to help feed. With deft movements, he dressed, except for his boots, and thudded down the steps, emerging into the courtyard just as he heard the second, more urgent summons from a hungry Rocky. When he saw that Camo was only just trudging up the steps outside the kitchen, clutching his bowl of scraps, Pemer drew a sigh of relief. He wasn't all that late. He thrust his feet into his boots, stuffed the laces inside to save time, and clomped across the court just as Manoli came down the steps from the main hall. Rocky, Mimic, and Lazy whirled above Pemer's head, chittering hungrily at him to move faster. Peemer glanced up, looking for Beauty. Manoli had told him that when the little queen was close to mating time, she'd seem to be more golden than ever. She was now circling to land on Manoli's shoulder, but she seemed the same color as ever. "Camo feed pretties?" The kitchen drudge smiled brightly as Manoli and Peemer reached him. "Camo feed pretties." Manoli and Peemer spoke the customary reassurance in chorus, grinning at each other as they reached for handfuls of meat scraps. Rocky and Mimic took their accustomed perches on Peemer's shoulders, while Lazy clung with far from indolent strength to his left forearm. Once the fire lizard settled to the business of eating, Peemer glanced at Manoli, wondering if she'd heard the drum message. She looked more awake than she usually did at this hour, and slightly detached from her immediate task. Of course, she might just be thinking up a new song, but writing tunes was not Manoli's only duty in the Harper Hall. As they fed the fire lizards, the rest of the hall began to stir. The drudges in the kitchen were roused to breakfast efforts by Sylvina and Abuna. In the junior and senior dormitories, occasional shouts punctuated random noises, and shutters on the journeymen's quarters were being opened to let in the fresh morning air.
Can I have another cookie?
I think one and some milk is enough. Why don't you get some milk if your stomach is still empty?
Okay.
Once the fire lizards had wheeled up for their morning stretch of wings, Peemer, Manoli, and Camo separated. Camo, with a push from Manoli, was sent back to the kitchen. Then she and Peemer went up the main steps of the Harper Hall to the dining room. Peemer's first class that morning was chorus, for they were, as usual at this time of the term, rehearsing the spring music
You got me a cup too.
for Lord Grow
Oh, wait,
He's
I'll get
feast.
some. You got the milk.
Master Domick had collaborated with Manoli this year and produced an uncommonly singable score for his ballad about Lessa and her golden queen dragon, Ramoth.
I need help getting another one of these cups.
You're telling the people who are listening to the reading that you need help with the cups?
That's because we're short.
That's because you're short. They are short. Peemer was to sing the part of Lessa. For once, he didn't object to having to sing a female role. In fact, that morning he waited eagerly for the chorus to finish the passage before his first entrance. The moment came, he opened his mouth, and to his amazement, no sound emerged. "Wake up, Peemer," said Master Domick, irritably rapping his stick on the music stand. He alerted the chorus. "We'll repeat the measure before the entrance. If you're now ready, Peemer." Usually, Peemer could ignore Master Domick's sarcasm, but since he had been ready to sing, he flushed uncertainly. He took a breath and hummed against his closed teeth as the chorus began again. He had tone, and his throat wasn't sore, so he wasn't coming down with a stuffed head. The chorus gave him his entrance again, and he opened his mouth. The sound that emerged ranged from one octave to another, neither of which were in the score he held. A complete and awed silence fell. Master Domick frowned at Peemer, who was now swallowing against a fear that froze his feet to one spot and crept up his bones to his heart. "Peemer, sir? Peemer, sing a scale in C." Peemer attempted to, and on the fourth note, though he had hardened his middle to iron for support, his voice broke again. Master Domick put down his stick and regarded Peemer. If there was any expression in the composition master's face, it was compassion, tinged with resigned irritation. "Peemer, I think you had best see Master Schonager. Tilgan, you've been understudying the role?" "Me, sir? I haven't so much as glanced at it, not with Peemer." The startled apprentice's voice trailed off as Peemer, slowly and with feet he could barely force to move, left the chorus hall and walked across the court towards Master Schonager's room. He tried to close his ears to the sound of Tilgan's tentative voice. Scorn gave him momentary relief from his cold fear. His had been a much better voice than Tilgan's would ever be. Had been? Maybe he was just coming down with a cold. Peemer coughed experimentally, but knew even as he did that no phlegm congested his lungs and throat. He trudged on to Master Schonager, knowing the verdict and hoping against vain hope that somehow the flaw in his voice was transitory, that he'd manage to keep his soprano range long enough to sing Master Domick's music. Scuffing up the steps, he paused briefly in the threshold to accustom his eyes to the gloom within. Master Schonager would only just have arisen and breakfasted. Peemer knew his master's habits intimately, but Schonager was already in his customary position, one elbow on the wide table, propping up his massive head, the other arm cocked against the columnar thigh. "Well, it's sooner than we might have expected, young Pemer," the master said in a quiet tone, which nonetheless seemed to fill the room. "But the change was bound to come sometime." A wealth of sympathy tinged the master's rich, mellow bass voice. The propping hand came away from the head and brushed aside the tones now issuing from the chorus hall. "Tilgin will never come up to your measure." "Oh, sir, what do I do now my voice is gone? It's all I had." Master Schoneger's surprised contempt startled Pemer. "All you had? Perhaps, my dear Pemer, but by no means all you have. Not after 5 turns as my apprentice. You probably know more about vocal production than any journeyman in the craft." "But who would want to learn from me?" Pemer gestured to his slight adolescent frame, his voice cracking dramatically. "And how could I teach when I've no voice to demonstrate?" But the distressing condition of your singing voice heralds other alterations that will remedy those minor considerations." Master Schoneger waved aside that argument and then regarded Pemer through narrowed eyelids. "This occasion has not caught me," the thick fingers tapped against the bulging chest, "unprepared." Now a gusty sigh escaped Master Schoneger's full lips. "You have been, without doubt or contradiction, the most troublesome and ingenious, the laziest, the most audacious and mendacious of the hundreds of apprentices and voice students it has been my tiresome task to train to some standard. Despite yourself, you have achieved some measure of success. You ought to have achieved even more." Master Schoneger affected a pout. "I find it altogether too perverse, if completely in character, for you to decide on puberty before singing Domic's latest choral work, undoubtedly one of his best, and written with your abilities in mind. Do not hang your head in my presence, young man." The master's bellows startled Pemer out of his self-pitiful reflections. "Young man. Yes, that's the crux. You are becoming a young man. Young men must have young manly tasks." "What?" In the single word, Pemer expressed his disbelief and distress. "That, my young man, is for the harper to tell you." Master Schoneger's thick forefinger pointed first at Pemer and then swung toward the front of the building, indicating Master Robinton's window. Pemer did not dare permit the hope that began to revive in him to blossom, yet Master Schoneger wouldn't lie for any reason, certainly not to give him false hope. Then they both winced as Tilgin erred in his sight-reading. Instinctively glancing at his master, Pemer saw the pained expression on Master Schoneger's face. "Were I you, young Pemer, I'd stay out of Domic's sight as much as possible." Despite his depression, Pemer grinned, wryly aware that the brilliant composition master might well decide that Pemer had elected to thwart his musical ambition in this untimely voice change. Master Schoneger sighed heavily. "I do wish you'd have waited a trifle longer, Pemer." His groan was wistful as well as resigned. "Tilgin is going to require much coaching to perform credibly. Now don't you repeat that, young Pemer." The thick forefinger pointed unwaveringly at Pemer, who affected innocent shock that such an admonition might be needed. "Away with you!" Obediently, Pemer turned, but he'd gone no more than a few paces to the door when a second shock stopped him. He whirled towards the voice master. "You mean just now, sir, don't you?" "Just now, sir? Of course I mean now. Not this afternoon or tomorrow, but now." "Now and always?" asked Pemer uncertainly. If he could no longer sing, Master Schoneger would take on another special apprentice to perform those personal and private duties for him that Pemer had been undertaking in the past turns. Not only was Pemer reluctant to lose the privilege of being Master Schoneger's special lad, he honestly didn't wish to end the very rewarding association with the master. He liked Schoneger, and those services he had performed for his master had stemmed from that liking rather than a sense of duty. He had enjoyed above all the droll humor and florid speech of his master, of being teased for his bold behavior and called to task by a man he had never managed to deceive for an instant with any of his stratagems or ploys. Now, yes. And there was a rumble of regret in Schonager's expressive voice that eased Peemer's sense of loss. But assuredly not always. And the master's tone was brisker, with only a hint of resigned irritation that he was not going to be forever rid of this small nuisance. How can we escape each other, immured as we are in the harbour hall?
Ah, yes, the small nuisance.
Though Peemer knew perfectly well that Master Schonager rarely left his hall, he was obscurely reassured. He made a half-turn and then came slowly back. This afternoon, you'll need some errands done? You may not be available, said Master Schonager, his face expressionless, his voice almost neutral. But, sir, who will come to you? And again Peemer's voice broke. You know, you're always super busy after the midday meal. If you mean, and Schonager spoke with real amusement, crinkling his eye folds, do I plan to appoint Tilgin to the vacancy? Shh! I shall, of course, have to devote a great deal of time to improving his voice and musicality, but to have him lurking about on tap. The thick fingers wiggled with distaste. Away with you! The choice of your successor requires considerable thought. Not, mind you, that there are not hundreds of likely lads who would undoubtedly suit my small requirements to perfection. Peemer caught his breath and hurt, and then saw the twitch of Master Schonager's expressive brows, and realized that this moment was no easier on the older man. Undoubtedly, Peemer tried to turn away on that light note, but found he could not. Wishing that Master Schonager might just this once. Go, my son. You will ever know where to find me, should the need arise. This time the dismissal was final, because the master slanted his head against his fist and closed his eyes, shamming weariness. It's just sad, you guys. Quickly, Peemer walked to the entrance, blinking at the bright sunlight after the darker hall. He paused on the bottom step, reluctant to take the final one that severed his association with Master Schonager. There was a sudden hard lump in his throat that had nothing to do with his voice change. He swallowed, but the sensation of constriction remained. He rubbed at his eyes with knuckles that came away moist and stood, fists clenched at his thighs, trying not to blubber. Master Robin had something to tell him about new duties, so his voice change had been discussed by the masters. To be sure, he wouldn't have been callously thrown out of the Harper Hall and sent in some obscure disgrace back to his herdsman father in the dreary life of a beast farmer simply because he no longer had a soprano voice. No, that wouldn't be his fate, despite the fact that singing was his one undeniable Harper skill. As Talmor said of his guitar and harp playing, he could accompany so long as his playing was drowned out by loud singing or other instruments. The drums and pipes he made for Master Durant's guidance were only passable, and never got stamped for sale at gathers. He copied scores accurately enough when he put his mind to it, but he always found so many more interesting things to do than spending hours cramping his fingers to renew records someone else could do more neatly and in half the time. Yet, when pushed to it, Peemer didn't actually mind scribing if he were allowed to add his own embellishments, which he wasn't. Not with Master Arner looking over his shoulder and muttering about wasted ink and hide. Peemer sighed deeply. The only thing he was really adept at was singing, and that was no longer possible. Forever? No, not forever. He spread his fingers in rejection of that prospect and then closed them into tighter fists. He'd be able to sing all right. He'd learned too much from Master Schonager about voice production and phrasing and interpretation, but he might not have a voice as an adult, and he wasn't going to sing unless he did. He had his reputation. Better if he never opened his mouth to sing another note. Tilgin flubbed another phrase. Peemer grinned, listening to Tilgan repeating the phrase correctly. They'd miss Peemer, all right. He could sight read any score, even one of Domic's, without missing a beat or an awkward interval, or those florid embellishments. Domic insisted on writing for the treble parts. Yes, they'd miss Peemer in the chorus. That knowledge fortified him, and he took the final step onto the flagstones of the court. Clipping his thumbs over his belt, he began to saunter toward the main entrance of the Harper Hall. Not, he reminded himself, that a lowly apprentice who has just lost his privileged position should saunter when sent to the Master Harper of Pern. Peemer squinted into the sunlight at the fire lizards on the roof opposite. He didn't spot Master Robinton's bronze fire lizard, Zare, among those sunning themselves with Manoli's 9. So the Master Harper wasn't with the day as yet. Come to think of it, Peemer reflected. He'd heard the clear baritone of voice of the Harper in the court late last night, and the noise of a dragon landing and departing. These days the Harper spent more time away from the hall than in it. Peemer? Startled, he glanced up and saw Manoli standing on the top step of the main hall. She'd spoken quietly, and when he peered at her, he knew that she knew what had happened to him. It was rather audible, she said, again in that gentle tone, which both irritated and appeased Peemer. Manoli, of all people within the Harper Hall, would sympathize with him most acutely. She knew what it was to be without the ability to make music. Is that Tilgan singing? Yes, and it's all my fault, Peemer said. All your fault? Manoli stared at him in surprised amusement. Why did I have to pick now to break voice? Why, indeed. I'm sure you did it only to annoy Domic. Manoli grinned broadly at him, for they both had experiences with Domic's whimsical temper. Peemer had reached the top step and experienced another shock on this morning of surprises. He could almost look Manoli squarely in the eye, and she was tall for a girl. She reached out and ruffled his hair,
How did he not notice?
laughing as he indignantly swatted her hand away. Come on, Master Robinton wants to see you. Why? What am I going to be doing now? Do you know? Not for me to tell you, scamp, she said, striding on her long legs across the hall and forcing him to jog pace to keep beside her. Manoli, that's not fair. Ha! She was pleased by his discomfiture. You've not long to wait. I will tell you this. Domic may not be pleased that your voice changed, but the master was. Aw, Manoli, one little hint, please? You know you owe me a favor or two. I do? Manoli savored her advantage. You do, and you know it. You could pay me back right now. Peemer was irritated. Why did she have to pick now to be difficult? Why waste a favor when a little patience on your part will bring the answer? They had reached the second level and were striding down the corridor toward the Harper's quarters. You'd better learn patience too, my friend. Peemer halted in disgust. Oh, come on, Peemer, she said with a broad swing of her arm. You're not a little one anymore to wheedle news out of me. And wasn't it you who warned me that you don't keep a master waiting? I've had enough surprises today, he said sourly, but he closed the distance between them just as she tapped politely on the door. The Master Harper of Pern, his silvering hair glinting in the sun streaming in his windows, was seated at the work table, a tray before him, the steam of hot claw rising unnoticed as he offered pieces of meat to the fire lizard clinging to his left forearm. Glutton, greedy maw, don't claw me, that's bare skin, not padding. I'm feeding you as fast as I can. Zare, behave yourself. I'm perishing for a taste of my claw, but I'm feeding you first. Good morning, Peemer. You're adept at feeding fire lizards. Pop sustenance into Zare's mouth so I can get some in mine. The Harper shot a look of desperate entreaty to Peemer. He whipped around the long work table and, grabbing up several chunks of meat, attracted Zare's gaze. Ah, that's more the thing, exclaimed Master Robinton after he'd had a long gulp of his claw. Absorbed in his task, Peemer wasn't at first aware of the Harper's scrutiny, for the man was applying himself to his own food with his free right hand. Then Peemer saw the keen eyes on him, lids narrowed as if weighty from sleep. He could tell nothing from the Harper's expression, for the long face was quiescent, slightly puffy about the eyes from sleep, and the grooves from the corners of the mobile mouth pulled down with age and accumulated fatigue rather than displeasure. I shall miss your young voice, said the Harper with a gentle emphasis on young, but while we're waiting for you to settle into an adult placement, I've asked Schoeniger to release you to me. I've a suspicion that you won't mind too much. and a smile twitched the Harper's lips. "Doing the odd job for me and Manoli and my good Sibel." "Manoli and Sibel?" Pemer gawped. "I'm not sure I care for that emphasis," said Manoli in a mock growl, subsiding as the Harper threw her a quieting glance. "I'd be your apprentice?" Pemer asked the Harper, holding his breath for the answer. "Indeed, you'd have to be my apprentice at that," said Master Robinson, his voice and face turning droll. "Oh, sir!" Pemer was stunned at such good fortune. Zaire squawked petulantly in the little silence, for Pemer had paused in his feeding. "Sorry, Zaire," and Pemer hastily resumed the task. "However," and the Harper cleared his throat while Pemer wondered what disadvantage to this enviable status was about to be disclosed. There had to be one, he knew. "You will have to improve your skills in scribing. We must be able to read what you write," said Manoli sternly. "Learn to send and receive drum messages accurately and rapidly." He looked at Manoli. "I know that Master Fandral is very keen to have his new message sender installed in every hall and craft, but it's going to take far too long to be useful to me. Then, too, there are some messages that should remain privy to the craft." He paused, staring long at Pemer. "You were bred on a runner beast hold, weren't you?" "Yes, sir, and I can ride any runner anywhere." Manoli's expression indicated disbelief. "I can, too." "You'll have ample chance to prove it, I fear," said the Harper, smiling at his new apprentice's stout claim. "What you will also have to prove, young Pemer, is your discretion." Now the Harper was in solemn earnest, and with equal solemnity Pemer nodded assurance. "Manoli tells me that despite your incorrigibility on many other counts, you're not given to indiscriminate babbling. Rather," and the Harper held up his hand as Pemer opened his mouth to reassure him, "that you keep close about incidental information until you can use it to your benefit." "Me, sir?" Master Robinson smiled at his wide-eyed, innocent expression. "You, sir, young Pemer. Although it does strike me that you've exactly the sort of guile—" He broke off, then continued more briskly, leaving unsaid words to tantalize Pemer. "We'll see how you get on. I fear you may find your new role not as exciting as you think, but you will be serving your craft, and me, very well indeed." If he couldn't sing for a while, thought Pemer, being the master's apprentice was the next best thing. Wait till he told Bonds and Timothy. Wouldn't they just choke? "Ever sailed?" asked Manoli with such a piercing look that Pemer wondered if she'd read his thoughts. "Sailed? In a boat?" "That's the general method," she said. "With my luck, you'll be a seasicker." "You mean I might get to the southern continent, too?" asked Pemer, having rapidly added up assorted pieces of information and come to a conclusion, all too hastily spoken, he realized belatedly. The Harper lost all semblance of lassitude and sat bolt upright in his chair, causing his fire lizard to protest vehemently. Manoli burst out laughing. "I told you, master," she said, throwing up her hands. "And what makes you mention the southern continent?" asked the Harper. Pemer was rather sorry now that he had. "Well, sir, nothing special," he said, wondering himself. "Just things like Sibel being gone for a couple of 7 days midwinter and coming back with a tanned face. Only I'd known he'd not been in Narad or Southern Bowl or Ista. There's been talk, too, at the gathers that even if dragon riders from the north aren't supposed to go south, some of the old-timers have been seen here in the north. Now, if I was Flar, I'd sort of wonder what those old-timers were doing north, and I'd try to keep them south where they're supposed to be. And there are all these holdless men looking for someplace to live, and no one seems to know how big the southern continent is, and if—" Pemer trailed off, daunted by the keen scrutiny of the Master Harper. "And if?" Master Harper urged him to continue. "Well, I've had to copy that map Fnor made of the southern hold in Weir, and it's small. No bigger than Crom or Nabol, but I've heard from Weir folk at High Regis who were in the south before Flar exiled the worst of the old-timers, and they said they were sure the southern continent must be pretty big." Pemer gestured broadly. "And?" The Harper's encouragement was firm. "Well, sir, if it were me, I'd want to know. 'Cause sure as eggs hatch, there's going to be trouble with those old-timers south." He jerked his thumb in that direction. "And trouble with the holdless men in the north." He turned his thumb back. "So when Manoli talks about sailing, I know how Sibel got south without being taken by a dragon, which Ben and Weir wouldn't permit, 'cause they promised the northern dragons wouldn't go south, and I don't think Sibel could swim that far. If he can swim." Master Robinson began to laugh, a soft chuckle, and he slowly swung his head from side to side. I wonder how many more people have put the same pieces together, Manoli, he asked, frowning. When his journeywoman shrugged, he added to Peemer, You've kept such notions to yourself, young man? Peemer gave a snort, realized he must be more circumspect with the master of his craft, and said quickly, Who pays any attention to what apprentices think or say? Have you mentioned these notions to anyone? The harper was insistent. Of course not, sir. Peemer tried to keep indignation from his tone. It's Bindon's business, or Hold business, or Harper business, not mine. A chance-spoken word, even by an apprentice, can sift through a man's thoughts till he forgets the source and remembers the intent, and repeats it inadvisedly. I know my loyalty to my craft hall, Master Robinson, said Peemer. I'm sure of your loyalty, the harper said, nodding his head slowly, his eyes still holding Peemer's. I want to be certain of your discretion. Manoli'll tell you I'm not a babble-mouth. He looked at Manoli for her support. Not normally, I'm sure, but you might be tempted to speak when taunted by others.